So Senator Elizabeth Warren with an amazing bill that she introduced last week, which would take on the issue of fair housing. So right now we're in the middle of a housing crisis. Of course, there's a lot of people that can't afford homes, but there are people that are being impacted even more so than everyone else, and that's, of course, the minority community. Now, Senator Warren's bill would take aim at some of those things that are keeping minorities from being able to own homes, and I think it's fantastic. So I'm going to go give you the details of this bill. For one, it's actually going to lower the development cost of housing. Now, the idea here is that if you have cheaper development costs, you end up with cheaper rents. They're not going to be able to justify higher rent. Now, it also aims to increase the supply of affordable housing, which also is supposed to lower rent, by putting billions in federal dollars into programs that would subsidize developments in rural, low-income, and middle-income communities. So, look, that's very important, especially when you have big city areas that are taken over by, basically gentrification, where you have really expensive condos and townhouses and actually really expensive regular homes placed in a lot of these areas. So when wealthy developers come in and they develop these properties that are meant for people who are actually quite wealthy, Silicon Valley, for example, that pushes everybody else out that can't afford those rents. So the idea here is let's put in affordable housing, subsidized housing in these areas so that we can bring people in who are not just wealthy, but people who are low income and middle income so they can live in these areas as well. So that's awesome. Now, this is one part of that bill. Again, Warren's bill actually attacks the issue of unaffordable housing in a lot of different ways. So here's another. What it would also do is it would change zoning laws. Now, the idea here is that certain discriminatory zoning laws passed by local city councils in local areas are making it very difficult to do affordable housing. It actually makes housing development even more expensive. But wait a minute here, you say. Zoning laws are generally set at a local level. What's Elizabeth Warren going to do about it? And the problem, of course, with zoning laws is that they end up limiting low-income residents to moving to wealthier neighborhoods. So, look, that problem actually is by design, I think, because there's a lot of these wealthier areas that are like, I don't want poor people moving in my neighborhood. I don't like poor people. I especially don't want poor minorities moving into my neighborhood. Well, sad day for you, because changing these zoning laws and putting in more affordable housing will solve that problem, or at least will go a long way to solve that problem. Now, but as I said, zoning laws are set up by local councils. What's Elizabeth Warren going to do with it? Well, part of her bill would actually create a block grant program, a competitive block grant program. Now, the grant money could be spent flexibly on schools, parks. Now, one problem here with creating more affordable housing in a lot of these areas is they'll say, well, look, we don't have room in our schools for all these people. Where are we going to, put them when it comes to education? Well, this solves that problem by saying, okay, look, here's block grant money. If you redo your zoning laws to be more inclusive to people who are low income, low and middle income, then you can use this money to expand your school and therefore solve that problem. All right, there you go. So that would actually have a big impact. Now, those communities can only access grants if they re-examine and redress land restrictions. So if they change their zoning laws to be more inclusive. Wonderful. I think that's a good idea. Now, the bill also looks at segregated communities. Now, under the bill, black families long denied mortgages by the federal government qualify for something called down payment assistance, which would, of course, help people pay a down payment in order to get a house. So anybody who's been house shopping knows that under current FHA loan guidelines, you have to put at least 20% down on a home. Now, for a lot of people, that is unattainable. And look, there are other types of loans, of course, but some require higher credit scores to be able to access those loans. Some have higher interest rates. And of course, FHA loans are actually the most popular type of loan through the federal government. And that's one where you have to have at least 20% down. Well, under this bill, they would help you pay that down payment to get you into a home if you're a first-time home buyer. Now, the targeting here is for people who were in formerly segregated communities. Now, the bill also would support, or I should say, would invest $2 billion to support borrowers still recovering from the financial crisis with negative equity on their mortgages. So there's a bailout for people who got hurt during the housing crisis. Now, additionally, the bill also would restructure the Community Reinvestment Act. Now, that is a 1977 law proposed to monitor banks with discriminatory loan practices against communities of color. Now, Warren's bill would give the CRA more enforcement mechanisms and expands its policing power to include credit unions and non-bank mortgage companies. Lastly, the bill would also strengthen anti-discrimination laws by expanding Fair Housing Act protections to include gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, and source of income. Not only that, but the whole purpose here is to stop the practice of redlining. Now, what is redlining? It's basically defined as the practice of denying or limiting financial services to certain neighborhoods based on racial and ethnic composition without regard to the residents' qualifications or creditworthiness. So that's, of course, a practice that has been widely used to discriminate against people of color and to prevent them from building intergenerational wealth through homes. One of the biggest ways to build wealth for your family is to own property, is to own a home. Unfortunately, a lot of minorities were traditionally limited from being able to do that, so they don't have access to that intergenerational wealth. Now, going back to that down payment assistance, that's also why that's really important. Because, look, there are white families that already have that intergenerational wealth. Not all of them, of course. I come from a family that doesn't have any of that, right? So now you think, okay, I can think that that's completely unfair to me, but a lot of white people actually do have that intergenerational wealth that they can draw upon. They can borrow in order to help with that down payment and get some sort of help from parents, grandparents, or maybe get a house handed to them. Again, I'm being very, very, very general because there's a lot of situations where white people don't have that. But there's even more examples of minorities not having that kind of intergenerational wealth, which means they've got no help in being able to get that house to be able to start building that wealth. That's what this bill targets and says, you know what? No, we're going to help you be able to afford that home so that you can build that wealth for your family through home ownership. Now, so I think this is great. This bill hits those problems of affordable housing from a lot of different angles. Is it complete? I don't know. Will it actually solve the problem? Well, there's a few people that say might not. I'll get to the criticism in a minute. But say what you will about Elizabeth Warren. On these issues, she's really good on this issue. All right. Now, Jenny Schutz, to go to the criticism here, she's a David M. Rubenstein fellow at the Brookings Institution. She notes that many neighborhoods with the strictest zoning laws are wealthy enough to not need federal funding, and in her opinion, would not be incentivized to making changes. So these are your wealthy gated communities that are predominantly white. Now, these are the areas that could use some desegregation. Again, they are basically segregated from everyone else in their nice little gated community. Schutz is making a great point here when she says if you're trying to incentivize some of these communities, you're going to have to offer them a lot of money. There's little incentive for them to participate otherwise. And that's a fair point. So, look, I don't know. I don't know if these ultra wealthy areas are going to take that money. There's a lot of other places that probably will. You don't know what's going to happen until you try it. So now, speaking of trying it, right now it's DOA. Of course, we've got a Republican Congress. They hate this. Now, Ben Carson, however, is like, oh no, I would love to tackle this issue because I am both black and on the housing and urban development. I'm the head of the agency. In case you guys forgot, because Ben Carson has basically been sleeping his way through his entire tenure, not really making news. But Carson himself has loosened rules in order to crack down on segregation when it comes to housing and, of course, people being ripped off. So he's not somebody that you should trust as an authority on this issue. Elizabeth Warren, however, I do trust her with this issue. The real hope here is if there is a blue wave come November, and that continues into 2020, we could actually see this kind of legislation be able to pass, which would be an enormous help for people struggling with not being able to own homes, not being able to afford rents. Because again, rent would actually go down. According to Moody's, who took a look at this bill, they determined that this would lower rents by 10% in 10 years. It's 1% a year, but 10%, it is modest, but it is a reduction, and that is good. And the study also concluded that the bill would go a long way towards addressing the mounting housing crisis. Awesome. Look, is this the 100% solution? I don't necessarily know. Is this a great start? Yeah, I think it is a good start because we've got to do something. And I think attacking this issue, because there are other housing bills that have been, passed before that didn't address all of the issues. This one is the most comprehensive piece of housing legislation that we've seen. And so big credit to Elizabeth Warren for not only drafting this, but for pushing for this, because it is a great piece of legislation. And hopefully it not only starts a discussion, but also going into where if the Democrats can retake control of power, can put this into action. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.